Hello, my name is Danielle Dykema. I am a PhD student at Iowa State University, and today I will be discussing some key terminology shared by both growers and plant breeders. These terms are yield potential, yield protection, and genetic gain. This presentation was created by myself and plant breeding students under the direction of Bill Beavis in conjunction with the North Central Soybean Research Program. So the reason for this video is that back in 2014, representatives of the North Central Soybean Research Program invited public plant breeders to discuss strategies to increase soybean yields by 50% by the year 2025. And during the discussions, soybean growers and breeders realized that we can benefit by spending more time discussing topics of common interest. This presentation was created as a way to facilitate communication and share information among soybean growers and public plant breeders. In particular, we will elaborate our understanding of the terms yield potential, yield protection, and genetic gain. Finally, we also want to touch on some of the challenges of estimating genetic gain, as it is critical to the long-term improvement of soybeans. Before we get into these terms, we should discuss another important term, yield. We know we want more of it, but how do we accomplish that? We sat down with some soybean growers and asked them questions about their opinions of the relationship between genetics, management practices, and yield. Let's say that you planted a new variety this year and it yields more than last year. Do you think this is because of improved genetics or something else?
Improved genetics.
Just that.
Well, yes. I mean, we've been conditioned to believe that, and I guess I've been growing. I don't know if that's the right word, but based on past experience and being a seed grower for a major company, that we're following their trials and their recommendations, and it's as a rule, I'd say it's genetics.
Oh boy, that could be a combination of those two and the third one, and that's just simply weather. Unless you're running a replicated trial and comparing your old variety with that new variety side by side in a replicated plot, same field, same management practices, and same weather, that's the only way you can come up with a fair idea if there's definitely a genetic difference there.
So what do you think is more important for increasing yield? Genetic improvement or improved management practices?
Well, I think the advances are coming from the genetic side. Management practices are changing all the time too, but I think the big improvements are coming on the genetic side.
So I think, of course, the genetics continue to improve, and with the use of GM and other better scientific methods, we're able to, of course, continue to improve genetics, not only to improve yield, but to improve nutrient efficiencies and some of those things too. I think marrying those two together, I don't think it's going to be genetic improvements that are going to help us solve all the world's problems. It's not going to be management practices that are going to solve all the world's problems either.
So we already have a concept of yield, but let's break it down a little further. Yield is a complex trait, meaning it is influenced by multiple factors, and we can break these factors down into three groups: genetics, management practices, and environment. The genetics component is a complex factor. It can be thought of as the baseline nature of the plant and is controlled by DNA. Most importantly, the genetics component can be manipulated by plant breeders to create new varieties with improved performance. The management practices component represents all the factors under the control of the grower, such as the application of fertilizer and pesticides, irrigation, and row spacing. And the environment component can be thought of as all the factors that influence yield that are beyond the control of genetics and management. It includes factors such as rainfall, temperature, pest pressure, and soil composition. For this presentation, we will represent yield like this. The height of these components will represent the total yield achieved for a given variety in a given scenario, and the size of each component will represent that component's contribution to the total yield. What do you think of when you hear the term yield potential?
Yield potential is what genetically is within the seed, And from that point forward, the final outcome is going to be affected by other variables such as weather and production practices, and climate and soil types.
Well, I think when I hear the word yield potential, I think that I wish I was younger in farming 20 years from now, because I know our potential is going to be a lot greater.
Now, the first term that we want to cover is yield potential. Yield potential is the maximum yield that a variety can possibly achieve given perfect inputs and perfect environmental conditions. This is in addition to any contributions from the variety's genetic component. Non-ideal conditions can prevent a variety from attaining its full yield potential. For example, these can include pest pressure, adverse weather conditions, and lack of adequate nutrients. Most critically, yield potential is dependent on genetics, so the way to increase your yield potential is to improve the genetics of the variety. In this presentation, the dashed line above each variety will represent yield potential. The closer the total yield is to the dashed line, the closer the variety is to reaching its yield potential. Let's look at some examples of yield versus yield potential. First, let's say you were to grow the exact same variety in the same field over multiple years. Since some years have better growing conditions than others, you would expect the yield to correspond with these differences. The better the year, the greater the yield. So how does this relate to yield potential? Assuming that you use the same set of practices each year, the only thing that changes from year to year is the contribution to yield from the environment. And here you can see that the environmental contribution is larger in better years. However, since this is the same variety with the same genetics, the yield potential is the same no matter the environment. Also notice that even in the good year, the yield still doesn't quite reach the full yield potential. This is because there is always some condition that wasn't quite perfect, be it temperature that was just a little too high or rainfall that didn't quite arrive on time. And you won't see a perfect year in real life, but the more you control the growing conditions, the closer you'll get to the yield potential. So what would things look like if we looked at two different varieties in the same environment and with the same inputs? In this example, we can clearly see that variety 2 has a much larger genetic contribution to yield than variety 1, and therefore has a greater total yield. Because of the larger genetic contribution, we can also see that variety 2 has a higher yield potential. Therefore, improving the genetics of a variety is crucial to improving yield potential. So in review, we can increase the yield potential by improving the genetics of the soybean varieties, and we can come closer to achieving that yield potential by improving the growing conditions as much as possible. Let's move on to our next topic. What do you think about the term yield protection?
Protection, I think of defense. So you're going to plant that bean in a where you think there'll be stressful conditions, so you protect the yield.
Yield protection a lot of times can be attributed to many of the new traits that we put on seed. They provide protective abilities for that genetic package that's in that seed.
Now, while we can think of yield protection in terms of defensive traits, we can also look at it in the context of yield potential. Yield protection includes all the methods of ensuring that you get as close to the yield potential as possible, such as by the application of fertilizer and by irrigating. And these methods also include genetic traits that prevent yield loss due to environmental conditions. And some of these examples are herbicide tolerance, SCN resistance, and drought tolerance. But the main thing to understand is that while they help to achieve better yields, none of these yield protection traits and methods actually increase the yield potential itself. Let's look at an example of yield protection by means of inputs. Here we can see that adding fertilizer helps to get closer to achieving the yield potential. Other examples that could work are applying herbicides to prevent weed competition and irrigating the field to prevent loss from drought. Another example of yield protection is through incorporating yield protective genetic traits. Here we are looking at the same variety with and without defensive genetic traits. Both have the same overall genetics that contribute to yield, but the version with the defensive traits has an additional genetics component that protects the yield. These traits, such as herbicide tolerance and SCN resistance, allow soybean plants to yield more and ultimately come closer to reaching their yield potential than their counterparts without these traits. Again, it is important to note that while these traits are genetic improvements, these traits do not increase the yield potential. Although, to be perfectly clear, the integration of defensive traits can have unintentional consequences for the yield potential in the form of yield drag, and this can happen if the breeders are not careful to minimize these effects. Finally, what do you think of when you hear the term genetic gain?
I mean that that seed that I'm planting has the potential to do a whole lot more for me. And the ultimate thing is yield, of course, but it does it with all the other attributes that that particular trait has.
I think yield improvement of possibly 1 to 3 bushels.
Yield increase.
So genetic gain is more than just increasing the yield of a variety. As we have discussed, yield is influenced by numerous factors. Here we can think of genetic gain as the metric by which we estimate genetic progress. And by this we mean we can estimate the increase in yield potential between the varieties, or in other words, the increase in the genetic contribution to yield. Now we can increase genetic gain through plant breeding programs, but estimating genetic gain can be tricky. In a plant breeding program, we aren't able to estimate the contribution of each component just by looking at the plant. We can, however, use careful experimental planning and advanced analytics to break down the overall yield into the individual components. Now, once we complete our analysis, we can see the contributions of each component. Here, the environmental components are the same, but the management practices and genetics components are larger in variety 2. However, when it comes to genetic gain, we only want to know the difference in the genetics component. Since we have calculated this component for each variety, the comparison is relatively easy to make and we can determine how much progress has been made. It should be noted that even with the best experimental planning and careful analysis, there is always some uncertainty of the exact contribution of each component towards the yield. Sometimes our analysis attributes yield to one component when the yield really came from another. For example, the analysis might attribute some of the total yield to genetics, when in reality that contribution came from the environment. It is also challenging to estimate genetic gain between varieties that were released years apart. While we can still use advanced analytics to calculate genetic gain, because the environment in which the varieties were grown have changed over time, the analysis can be more difficult. And in conclusion, while it is possible to calculate genetic gain, there is always some potential error, whether it is due to the environment or experimental errors. This concludes our presentation of yield potential, yield protection, and genetic gain. This production was made possible by the North Central Soybean Research Program and the Iowa State University Department of Agronomy. Special thanks to Ed Anderson and the NCSRP for their support and feedback used to design this presentation. And thanks to our interview contributors for their generous participation in this video. Thanks for watching.